She is completely out of her mind. My father Marcus barked the words across the sterile courtroom, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face, as if I were nothing more than garbage on the street. I stayed perfectly silent with my hands folded neatly in my lap. The judge pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, flipped a page in the thick financial dossier before him, and leaned forward. He looked dead into my father's eyes and asked, "You really do not know, do you?" The high-priced lawyer standing next to my father froze instantly. The color completely drained from my father's face, turning his angry flush into a sickly pale gray. My arrogant brother-in-law Bradley fumbled and dropped his expensive pen onto the hardwood floor. "Wait, what?" my father stammered. "My name is Maya, and I am 32 years old. 8 months ago, my own family tried to throw me into a psychiatric ward and strip away my entire life through a dirty conservatorship. They wanted to seize control of my assets and my freedom. But what they did not know was that their greedy little plan was actually the final nail in their own coffin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by your own flesh and blood and had to take matters into your own hands. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I sent them straight to federal prison. Growing up in the affluent neighborhood of Buckhead in Atlanta, Georgia, meant our lives were supposed to look flawless. My parents, Marcus and Vivian, built a highly successful logistics company from the ground up. To the outside world, we were the pinnacle of African American excellence. We lived in a massive brick estate with perfectly manicured hedges and luxury cars parked in the circular driveway. But behind those heavy mahogany double doors, the environment was suffocating and entirely conditional. Love was not freely given in our house. It was a transaction. You had to earn it by fitting perfectly into their grand social narrative. My older sister Chloe was the undisputed golden child. She played the game flawlessly. She went to the right schools, joined the right sororities, and eventually became a high-profile corporate lawyer. To crown her achievements, she married Bradley, a wealthy white hedge fund manager from Wall Street who oozed arrogance and privilege. Bradley fit right into my parents' twisted value system. He wore bespoke suits, drove a Porsche, and casually dropped names of powerful politicians at our Sunday dinners. My parents treated him like royalty, hanging on to his every word about market trends and investment portfolios. Then there was me. I was the family disappointment, the designated black sheep who never quite fit the mold. When I was 20 years old, the intense pressure of my parents' expectations caused me to have a severe depressive episode. I had to take a semester off from college to focus on my mental health. Instead of supporting me, my family viewed my struggle as a deep humiliation. From that moment on, they labeled me as unstable and fragile. My mother never missed a chance to bring it up, framing my entire existence around that one brief period of vulnerability. They assumed I was just barely scraping by as a freelance bookkeeper, taking whatever low-level accounting jobs I could find. To them, my modest apartment and quiet lifestyle were absolute proof of my failure. They did not understand that I chose to live under the radar. My mother would look at my sensible shoes and sigh loudly, complaining that I was a visual embarrassment to the family name. Bradley constantly patronized me, offering me scraps of financial advice, while my sister looked on with smug pity. What none of them knew was that I was not just some struggling number cruncher. I had graduated at the top of my class and secretly built a formidable career. I am a senior forensic accountant for the Internal Revenue Service. My job is to track down financial fraud, uncover money laundering schemes, and bring down white-collar criminals. And for the past 2 years, my primary target had been a massive Ponzi scheme operating out of Bradley's supposedly prestigious investment firm. For years, I endured their condescension and their cruel jokes about my mental state. I sat quietly at family dinners while Bradley explained basic economics to me as if I were a child, and my parents lamented how I was wasting my potential. I let them believe I was weak because my undercover work required absolute discretion. I was waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger on my investigation. But their greed accelerated the timeline in a way I never could have predicted. The tipping point arrived on a humid Saturday evening during my parents' elaborate anniversary party at one of Atlanta's most exclusive private country clubs. This was the night they decided to make their ultimate move against me, setting off a chain of events that would force me to tear down their perfect world piece by piece. The crystal chandeliers at the Buckhead Country Club cast a golden glow over the 50 guests gathered for my parents' 40th anniversary dinner. Waiters in crisp white jackets floated between tables carrying trays of seared scallops and vintage champagne. To anyone looking in from the outside, we were the absolute picture of African American elite royalty. My parents, Marcus and Vivian, sat at the head of the long banquet table, glowing under the admiration of Atlanta's most influential business owners. My sister Chloe sat to their right, dripping in diamonds and wrapped in a silk gown that cost more than a reliable used car. Beside her was her husband Bradley. Bradley was currently swirling a glass of scotch and holding court, loudly explaining the genius of his latest hedge fund acquisition. His custom-tailored suit screamed Wall Street money. I sat directly across from him, sipping sparkling water and letting my eyes scan the room. I was comfortable in my understated black dress, calculating the exact cost of this ridiculous spectacle. Suddenly, the ambient noise of the string quartet was shattered by Bradley's booming voice. He slammed his heavy crystal glass onto the table and leaned forward, zeroing in on me with a predatory grin. "Maya, are you still crunching numbers for those bottom feeder companies?" he asked. His voice was deliberately loud, designed to draw the attention of the aunts, uncles, and family friends seated nearby. The lively chatter around us died down instantly. Every eye at the table shifted in my direction. I placed my water glass down smoothly. "I am a freelance accountant, Bradley. I help businesses organize their finances. It is honest work." "Honest work," he scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Your parents are the absolute elite of Atlanta. They built a logistics empire. Chloe is a senior partner at her law firm. And you are sitting at a kitchen table sorting out receipts for mom-and-pop shops. Do you not feel completely embarrassed by that?" A few extended relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one said a word. In this family, wealth was the only metric of respect. Since I drove a sensible sedan and lived in a modest apartment, I was fair game for public humiliation. I looked at Bradley. I noticed the limited edition Rolex on his wrist, a watch that retailed for exactly $85,000. A very interesting purchase for a man whose investment firm had allegedly suffered massive market losses in the previous quarter. My internal IRS radar pinged loud and clear, but I kept my face perfectly blank. "Actually, Bradley, numbers tell a fascinating story," I replied, keeping my tone dangerously mild. "You would be absolutely shocked by what people try to hide in their ledgers. Sometimes the people wearing the most expensive suits are running the biggest deficits." Bradley's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He did not know I was a federal agent, but a guilty conscience always reacts to the word hide. Before he could snap back, Chloe leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hand on his arm. She flashed a devastatingly sweet smile, the kind she used in court right before destroying a witness. "Now, Bradley." "Leave Maya alone," Chloe crooned, her voice dripping with venomous pity. "You know she cannot handle high-stress environments. We have to be gentle with her." I braced myself. Here it comes, the ultimate weapon. "We all remember what happened when she was 20. Chloe continued, sighing dramatically for the audience. College was just too much pressure for her fragile mind. She had that terrible breakdown. We are just thankful she can handle basic addition and subtraction without having another depressive episode. We certainly do not expect her to build a real career like the rest of us." A low murmur rippled through the table. My mother Vivian nodded in solemn agreement, wiping a completely fake tear from her eye. "It has been such a heavy burden on our family," Vivian added, looking around at the guests seeking their sympathy. "We have always had to lower our expectations for Maya. She just does not have the mental fortitude to succeed in our world." My fingernails dug into my palms under the table, but my face remained an impassive mask. They were doing it again, weaponizing a brief period of depression I suffered over a decade ago. Back then, the toxic weight of their constant perfectionism had crushed me. I had sought therapy, took a semester off to heal, and then returned to graduate summa cum laude. But in their eyes, that temporary struggle was a permanent brand of insanity. They used it to invalidate my intelligence, to silence my opinions, and to justify treating me like a defective child. Bradley regained his swagger, sensing the room was entirely on his side. "Exactly, Chloe," he said, patting his wife's hand. "Which is why I am trying to give her some tough love. Maya, if you ever want to step up to the big leagues, let me know. My firm manages hundreds of millions of dollars. I could probably find you a spot in the mailroom, or maybe you can bring coffee to my real accountants." The table erupted into polite chuckles. My father Marcus let out a booming laugh, raising his glass toward his golden son-in-law. "Excellent point, Bradley. Maybe some exposure to real wealth would cure her lack of ambition." I sat perfectly still, absorbing their mockery. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw my drink in Bradley's face. I simply looked at the men and women tearing me down and cataloged their sins. Marcus was currently funneling corporate funds through offshore shell companies. Vivian was signing off on fraudulent tax returns to fund her lavish lifestyle. Chloe was providing the legal loopholes to keep them out of jail. And Bradley was the arrogant mastermind tying all their dirty money into a massive Wall Street Ponzi scheme. They thought they were untouchable predators circling a wounded animal. They had absolutely no idea that the woman sitting across from them possessed the federal clearance to freeze every bank account they owned. They thought my silence was weakness. It was actually restraint. I smiled warmly at my brother-in-law, holding his gaze until his laughter felt forced. "Thank you for the generous offer, Bradley," I said smoothly. "I am perfectly happy with the accounts I am currently auditing. You never know when you might uncover a complete disaster just waiting to collapse." He glared at me, entirely missing the double meaning of my words. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. The string quartet in the background shifted to a faster tempo, contrasting the heavy silence that fell over our corner of the room. My mother quickly signaled the waiters to pour more champagne, eager to redirect the attention back to her anniversary celebration. I watched my mother lean over to a wealthy socialite, whispering something while gesturing subtly in my direction. The socialite cast a pitying glance my way. It was a well-rehearsed routine. Vivian loved playing the tragic mother of a troubled child. It garnered her sympathy and made her own accomplishments shine even brighter. "Look at her dress," Chloe whispered loudly to Bradley, though she fully intended for me to hear. "Did she buy that off a clearance rack? It is a country club anniversary dinner, not a funeral." "Actually, Chloe," I replied, my voice slicing cleanly through the clinking of silverware, "it is a vintage piece. But I understand why you prefer loud labels. Sometimes people need to wear their wealth on the outside when they are completely bankrupt on the inside." Chloe's eyes flashed with pure venom. She gripped her fork tightly, her knuckles turning white. "You are completely delusional, Maya," she hissed, dropping the sweet sister act. "You sit there acting like you are above us, but you are just bitter. You are a bitter, broke spinster who has accomplished absolutely nothing." I let her words hang in the air. I let the silence stretch out, forcing her to sit in her own hostility. I looked at the extravagant diamond necklace resting on her collarbone. I knew exactly which illegal offshore wire transfer had funded that piece of jewelry. The urge to slide my federal badge across the pristine white tablecloth was intoxicating, but I forced myself to remain disciplined. The net was not entirely closed yet. "I am not bitter, Chloe," I said softly, leaning back in my chair. "I am just highly observant." Bradley scoffed aggressively, shifting his broad shoulders. "Observant? Please. If you were truly observant, you would realize you are embarrassing your parents just by sitting here. If I were you, I would keep my mouth shut and show some gratitude." He was right about one thing. I was going to be very observant. I was going to observe every single mistake they made moving forward. The dinner dragged on an endless parade of self-congratulations and disguised insults. But the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the passive victim of their psychological abuse. I was the architect of their impending destruction, and this dinner was simply the calm before the storm. The lingering silence at our end of the table was completely at odds with the celebratory atmosphere of the country club. My mother, Vivian, possessed a terrifying ability to read the temperature of any room and manipulate it to her advantage. She had spent the last 4 decades curating an image of absolute perfection. To her, I was not a daughter. I was a persistent stain on her flawless canvas. I could see the muscles in her neck tighten as she watched Bradley visibly bristle from my quiet defiance. In Vivian's world, no one challenged the men who brought in the money. And Bradley, with his Wall Street pedigree, was the ultimate prize she loved to parade before Atlanta's high society. My refusal to play the role of the submissive broken sister was an active threat to her carefully constructed narrative. Vivian set her linen napkin on the table with calculated precision, her eyes dark and hard locked onto me from across the centerpiece of imported white orchids. She reached for her freshly poured glass of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon. The dark red liquid swirled heavily against the crystal. She offered a brilliant, practiced smile to the table of local politicians seated to our left. "Excuse me for just a moment," she announced, her voice musical and light. "I simply must greet the senator and his lovely wife." She rose from her seat at the head of the table. Her beaded gown caught the light of the chandeliers sparkling with every step. She moved with the grace of a woman who owned the room, gliding behind the chairs of our relatives. I watched her approach out of the corner of my eye. I knew her tactics intimately. When verbal intimidation failed to force compliance, Vivian resorted to physical dominance. She needed to re-establish the hierarchy. She needed to remind the guests that she was the benevolent matriarch and I was the tragic mess. As she stepped directly behind my chair, she paused. I felt the sudden shift in the air right before it happened. There was no stumble. There was no accidental bump from a passing waiter. There was only the deliberate tilt of her wrist. A cold, heavy wave of dark red wine cascaded over my shoulder. The liquid splashed violently against my collarbone, soaking instantly into the fabric of my understated black dress. The wine bled down my chest, pooling coldly against my skin and dripping onto my lap. A collective gasp erupted from the surrounding tables. The lively chatter in our immediate vicinity died instantly, leaving only the upbeat tempo of the string quartet playing in the background. Waiters froze in their tracks. Family members turned their heads, their eyes wide with feigned shock. "Oh my goodness," Vivian cried out, pressing her empty crystal glass against her chest. Her voice was loud enough to carry across the dining room, ensuring we had a captive audience. "Maya, look at what you have done. You bumped right into me. You are always so clumsy." I sat perfectly still. The cold wine seeped uncomfortably through my clothes, but I did not scramble for a napkin. I did not leap out of my chair in embarrassment. I simply turned my head and looked up at my mother. Her face was arranged in a mask of maternal distress, but her eyes were gleaming with pure malicious triumph. She had successfully turned me into a spectacle. "You are a complete disaster," Vivian hissed, dropping the musical tone. She grabbed a cloth napkin from the table and began dabbing aggressively at my shoulder, making sure to press the red stain deeper into the fabric. "You cannot even sit through a simple anniversary dinner without causing a humiliating scene. Look at yourself. You are a mess. You are ruining the entire evening for everyone." I gently but firmly reached up and removed her hand from my shoulder. "Please stop," I said quietly. "You are only making the stain worse." Vivian snatched her hand back as if she had been burned. She stood tall, glaring down at me with absolute disgust. "That is exactly your problem, Maya. You refuse to let anyone help you. You sit there in your cheap little dress, dragging down the energy of this entire family with your constant negativity. We bring you to a beautiful venue. We introduce you to important people. And how do you repay us? You act like a sullen child throwing a tantrum because you cannot handle being around successful adults." The people at the neighboring tables were openly staring now. Chloe let out a long, dramatic sigh, shaking her head in mock disappointment. Bradley swirled his scotch, watching the scene unfold with a satisfied smirk. He was thoroughly enjoying watching my mother do his dirty work. "You are totally useless," Vivian continued, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "You contribute absolutely nothing to this family. Your father and I built a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Your sister is a brilliant attorney. Bradley manages more money in a day than you will see in your entire pathetic lifetime. And what do? You hide in your apartment. You scrape by doing freelance taxes for nobodies. You are 32 years old, and you are a complete void of ambition. It is an absolute embarrassment to the family name. I picked up my own napkin and calmly wiped a drop of wine from my cheek. Her words were designed to cut me to the bone, to break me down until I apologized for simply existing. Years ago, this kind of public dressing down would have sent me spiraling into a panic attack. I would have run to the bathroom in tears, believing every toxic word she said. But the woman sitting in this chair was not the fragile 20-year-old they remembered. I was a trained federal investigator. I had stared down cartel bosses and corrupt billionaires in interrogation rooms. My mother's country club theatrics were nothing more than a pathetic display of a desperate woman. You seem very focused on my finances tonight, Mother, I replied, keeping my tone dangerously level. Is there a reason my modest lifestyle offends you so deeply? Are you perhaps projecting your own financial anxieties onto me? Vivian's eyes widened in genuine shock. For a second, the mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine panic, before the anger rushed back in to cover it up. She slammed her hands down on the back of my chair, leaning in so closely I could smell the expensive gin on her breath. "How dare you speak to me that way?" she spat, her voice dropping into a vicious, venomous whisper, meant only for me and the family members seated closest to us. "You are completely out of control, Maya. You are spiraling again just like you did in college. Your mind is clearly deteriorating. You sit here making psychotic accusations against your own family. You are deeply, deeply unwell." She straightened up and looked at Marcus, who was watching the scene with a heavy scowl. "Marcus, look at her," Vivian pleaded, playing the role of the exhausted victim. "She is completely unstable. We have tried to be patient. We have tried to give her space to find herself. But she is clearly incapable of managing her own life. She is a danger to herself and a liability to this family." I watched the silent communication pass between my mother, my father, and my sister. This was not a spontaneous outburst. This was a coordinated narrative. They were actively building a case against my sanity, right here in the middle of a crowded dining room. They needed an audience to witness my supposed instability. They needed witnesses who would later agree that poor Vivian and Marcus were just trying to help their troubled daughter. "We cannot let this continue," Vivian declared, her voice ringing with finality. "We cannot let you destroy yourself or drag our reputation through the mud. It is painfully obvious that you cannot take care of yourself. We are going to have to take drastic measures to manage you, Maya, for your own good. We have to step in and take control before you do something completely irreparable." The words drastic measures hung heavily in the air. The threat was crystal clear. But as my mother glared down at me, expecting to see fear in my eyes, my mind was moving at lightning speed, connecting the data points. As a forensic accountant, I knew that when people suddenly need absolute control over a family member, it is rarely about healthcare. It is always about money. My grandfather had left me a substantial trust fund and a beautiful historic property in my name alone, specifically bypassing my parents because he knew how greedy they were. I lived modestly, but my assets were completely unencumbered. Meanwhile, my investigation into Bradley's hedge fund had recently revealed severe liquidity issues. His Wall Street firm was bleeding cash. My parents' logistics company was heavily invested in his fraudulent portfolios. They were all drowning in debt, hiding behind designer clothes and luxury cars. They did not care about my mental health. They needed my signature. They needed my clean assets to plug the massive gaping holes in their own sinking ship. And the only way to gain access to my accounts without my consent was to have me declared legally incompetent. They were trying to build a foundation to trap me in a conservatorship. I looked at my mother's desperate, angry face. I looked at Bradley's smug grin. I looked at my father, who was preparing to stand up and address the room. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought stripping me of my autonomy would save them from financial ruin. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 2 years mapping every single illegal transaction they had ever made. By trying to steal my life, they were actively inviting the Internal Revenue Service to perform a deep dive into their own. I remained seated in my wine-stained dress, breathing slowly and deliberately, waiting for them to make their final fatal mistake. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of neon streetlights and the rhythmic hum of my tires against the Atlanta pavement. I did not turn on the radio. The silence in the car was a canvas for my thoughts, calculating the precise sequence of events that would unfold at dawn. My encrypted phone rested in the passenger seat, a silent testament to the storm I had just unleashed. The message to my director was not a request for permission. It was a tactical update. The operation had been building for 2 years, and my family had just provided the final piece of actionable evidence. I pulled into the modest parking garage of my apartment complex. It was a stark contrast to the sprawling estates my parents and sister occupied, but it was mine. It was secure. And most importantly, it was entirely disconnected from the toxic web of the Wilson family wealth. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting through the wine-soaked fabric of my dress. I ignored the sticky discomfort taking the stairs to the 3rd floor with purposeful strides. Inside my apartment, I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight into the small room I used as an office. The space was dominated by a massive dual-monitor setup and a heavy-duty cross-cut shredder. The walls were lined with physical files, backup drives, and flowcharts that mapped the entire illicit ecosystem of my family's finances. I booted up the secure workstation, entering a 12-character alphanumeric passcode, followed by a biometric scan. The screens flared to life, displaying the secure portal of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. A priority message from Director Vance was already waiting in my inbox. Operation Vanguard is greenlit. Asset freeze warrants are being processed by the federal judge now. Tactical teams will be on standby for a 0600 hours deployment. Confirm target locations and current status. I cracked my knuckles, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I began typing with mechanical precision, confirming the residential addresses for Marcus and Vivian Wilson Chloe and Bradley Thornton, and the corporate headquarters for both the logistics company and the hedge fund. I attached the final tracking numbers for the offshore shell accounts Bradley had been using to funnel the stolen money. By volunteering to act as my conservator, Bradley had legally linked his primary operating accounts to my heavily monitored federal bait accounts. He had built a bridge directly into his own vault. With the tactical deployment confirmed, I finally stood up and stripped off the ruined black dress. I threw it directly into the trash can, the dark stain a physical reminder of my mother's pathetic attempt at dominance. I took a hot shower, scrubbing the smell of the country club and the stale wine from my skin. As the hot water cascaded over me, I felt a profound sense of detachment. I was not mourning the loss of my family. You cannot mourn something that never truly existed. I changed into a comfortable pair of dark tactical pants and a black sweater. I brewed a strong pot of coffee and sat back down at my workstation. The digital clock in the corner of my screen read 0200 hours, 4 hours until the raid. I opened a separate encrypted file, pulling up the preliminary paperwork my parents had filed for the conservatorship. They had moved fast, utilizing a corrupt judge on their payroll to fast-track the emergency petition. The documents were a masterpiece of legal fiction, claiming I was suffering from severe manic episodes and posed an immediate threat to my own physical and financial well-being. Chloe had drafted the petition using her law firm's letterhead to lend it an air of unquestionable legitimacy. I smiled, a cold, humorless expression. Chloe was about to learn a very hard lesson about federal perjury. At 0530 hours, my secure phone vibrated against the desk. It was Vance. "Agent Wilson?" "Vance," said his voice crisp and professional. "Warrants are signed. Warrants are active. We have eyes on all 3 target locations. The financial lockdown hits the banking networks in exactly 10 minutes. Every account associated with Marcus, Vivian, Chloe, and Bradley will be frozen solid." "Copy that, Director?" I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. I want full tactical presence at the Thornton residence. Bradley is a flight risk. If he checks his banking apps before the breach and realizes his offshore accounts are locked, he will try to run. Tactical teams are in position, Vance confirmed. We are moving in. I suggest you get comfortable, Agent Wilson. The dominoes are about to fall. The line went dead. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes locked on the digital clock. The seconds ticked away with agonizing slowness. At precisely 0600 hours, I opened a specialized monitoring program on my left monitor. The screen displayed a network of financial nodes representing the Wilsons' various bank accounts, investment portfolios, and shell companies. At 0601 hours, the first node turned red. It was Marcus and Vivian's primary checking account at Atlanta First National. Frozen. Seconds later, a cascade of red swept across the screen. Bradley's domestic hedge fund accounts. Red. Chloe's corporate partnership accounts. Red. The Cayman Island shell companies Bradley used to hide the Ponzi scheme funds. Red. In less than 60 seconds, billions of dollars of illicit wealth were locked down, seized by the United States Treasury. My phone began to buzz frantically on the desk. The caller ID flashed Marcus Wilson. I ignored it. The phone stopped buzzing only to immediately light up again. This time it was Vivian, then Chloe, then Bradley. A relentless barrage of desperate incoming calls. They were waking up to the nightmare. Their credit cards were declining. Their banking apps were showing zero available balances. Their entire financial reality had just been vaporized. I let the phone ring. I opened my email and began drafting a very specific message. I addressed it to Marcus, Vivian, Chloe, and Bradley. I attached a single PDF file to the email. It was a copy of my official federal credentials, identifying me as a senior special agent for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I typed a single sentence in the body of the email. I believe the audit has officially begun. I hit send just as a new notification popped up on my secure terminal. It was a live feed from one of the tactical teams deployed at Bradley and Chloe's sprawling estate in Buckhead. I clicked the feed, maximizing the video on my right monitor. The grainy night vision footage showed 3 black SUVs parked aggressively on the pristine manicured lawn. Heavily armed federal agents in tactical gear were stacked against the massive oak front doors. I watched as the lead agent raised a heavy battering ram. With a single synchronized strike, the heavy doors splintered and burst open. "Federal agents, search warrant, show me your hands!" The audio crackled through my speakers. I watched the tactical team flood the grand foyer. Within seconds, the cameras caught Bradley Thornton sprinting down the curved staircase, clutching a briefcase, his face pale with absolute terror. He did not look like the smug Wall Street titan from the country club. He looked like a cornered rat. He tried to pivot toward the back door, but 2 agents tackled him to the marble floor, pinning his arms behind his back. "Bradley Thornton, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion." Chloe appeared at the top of the stairs, her silk robe hastily tied. She was screaming, demanding badge numbers, threatening to sue every agent in the building. A female agent calmly walked up the stairs and secured Chloe's wrists in zip ties, informing her that she was being detained for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. I switched the feed to my parents' estate. The scene was less violent but equally satisfying. Marcus was standing in his driveway, wearing a silk bathrobe, his hands cuffed in front of him. He was arguing furiously with an agent demanding to call his lawyer. Vivian was sitting on a stone bench near the fountain, weeping hysterically as agents carried boxes of physical documents out of Marcus's private study. The illusion of their untouchable elite status was completely shattered. They were just common criminals, waiting to be processed. My personal phone finally stopped ringing. A single text message appeared on the screen. It was from a burner number I recognized as Bradley's secondary phone, which the agents must not have confiscated yet. "What did you do?" I picked up the phone. I did not type a long explanation. I did not gloat. I simply replied with a single word: observation. I placed the phone face down on the desk. The sun was beginning to rise over the Atlanta skyline, casting long shadows across my small office. The massive criminal enterprise that had funded my family's arrogance for decades was dead. The conservatorship petition was now nothing more than a piece of evidence in a massive federal prosecution. They had tried to lock me in a cage to steal my future. Instead, they had handed me the keys to their own prison cells. I stood up, stretched my arms, and walked into the kitchen to pour another cup of coffee. It was going to be a very busy day at the office, and I was entirely prepared for the paperwork. The paperwork, however, would have to wait. Less than 3 hours after the tactical teams processed my family into federal holding, Director Vance walked into my office with a grim expression. Through a staggering display of high-priced legal maneuvering and a mountain of hastily secured bail bonds, Chloe and Bradley had managed to secure a temporary release pending their formal arraignment. Their passports were seized and their accounts were frozen solid, but they were physically free for the moment. I expected them to lay low. I expected them to spend the morning huddled with their defense attorneys, frantically trying to untangle the federal web I had woven around them. I severely underestimated the depths of their delusion and their ravenous greed. I drove my sensible sedan out to the suburbs, specifically toward the historic property my grandfather had left me. The estate was a sprawling, beautifully restored Victorian home sitting on 3 acres of prime real estate. It was a quiet sanctuary filled with ancient oak trees and wrap-around porches. It was my only true home. As I turned onto the long gravel driveway, my foot hit the brake pedal instinctively. A white commercial van was parked haphazardly across the front walkway. The side of the vehicle displayed the logo for a local emergency locksmith. Standing on my front porch, looking significantly worse for wear after their morning in federal holding, were my sister Chloe and her husband Bradley. I parked the car and stepped out into the crisp morning air. My front lawn was littered with my personal belongings. Chloe was actively kicking a heavy canvas duffel bag down the wooden porch stairs. It tumbled end over end, spilling a pair of my running shoes and several books into the damp grass. Bradley stood near the front door, barking orders at a nervous-looking man in a work uniform who was holding a heavy-duty drill against the brass lock of my front door. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet lawn. I did not yell. I did not rush forward. I simply walked up the driveway with measured steps. Chloe spun around. Her designer silk outfit from the night before had been replaced by a wrinkled trench coat, but her face was twisted into a mask of absolute hatred. She looked at me not with the caution of someone who had just been raided by the IRS, but with the furious disdain of a superior dealing with an unruly subordinate. "I am renting this house out," Chloe snapped, marching down the stairs to stand over my scattered belongings. "Since you decided to pull that psychotic stunt this morning, calling in anonymous tips to federal agencies and forging government badges, we are taking immediate action. I have already contacted a luxury real estate broker. This property will be leased by the end of the week. That money will go directly into a psychiatric treatment fund for you. You are dangerous and unhinged, Maya. You are going to be locked in a facility until you are completely cured of these delusions." I stared at her, letting the sheer magnitude of her narcissism wash over me. She had seen my federal credentials in the email. She had been tackled by tactical agents. Yet her ego was so fragile, so utterly impenetrable, that she had convinced herself I was simply a crazy person who had swatted them and fabricated an IRS identity. She truly believed her emergency guardianship petition signed by a corrupt judge at 1 a.m. shielded her from reality. This house was the ultimate prize Chloe had coveted for years. When our grandfather Theodore fell ill with terminal cancer, my parents and Chloe had treated him like a burden. They complained about the smell of his medications, the inconvenience of visiting the hospice, and the depressing nature of his decline. I was the only one who moved in with him. I spent 18 months working remotely, sitting by his bedside reading his favorite novels, and managing his care around the clock. When he passed away, he left his entire estate exclusively to me. He knew exactly who his family was, and he wanted to ensure I had a safe haven away from their toxic influence. Chloe had contested the will for 3 years, claiming I had manipulated a dying man. She lost, but the bitter jealousy had festered inside her ever since. She hated that I owned a $4 million property outright, while she was drowning in the hidden debt of her lavish lifestyle. "You have absolutely no legal right to touch this property," I stated calmly, keeping my distance from the bags on the grass. "The deed is in my name alone," Bradley scoffed, stepping away from the locksmith and walking to the edge of the porch. His arrogant swagger had returned, fueled by desperate necessity. He needed cash immediately to pay for his criminal defense, and my house was the only unfrozen asset he thought he could reach. "Not anymore," Maya Bradley sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. The judge signed the emergency guardianship petition early this morning. We brought the paperwork straight to the local precinct. "You are officially deemed legally incompetent to manage your own affairs. Chloe is your guardian, and I am the financial conservator of this estate. We control your accounts. We control this property. The locksmith is finishing up right now, and you are officially evicted." The locksmith stopped drilling. He looked over his shoulder, shifting uncomfortably. "Ma'am," he said, addressing me hesitantly, "they showed me court documents. I am just doing my job." I looked at the locksmith, offering him a reassuring nod. "You can continue," I told him. "It is entirely fine." Chloe let out a sharp, victorious laugh. She crossed her arms, mirroring her husband's arrogant posture. "Good. For once in your life, you are actually accepting reality. You are going to a secure facility, Maya. We are going to pack up your cheap clothes and sell this house to cover the damage your little psychotic episode caused our businesses this morning. I will personally see to it that you never control a single dollar of grandfather's money again." I did not cry. The instinct to defend myself, to scream that I was a federal agent to demand they get off my property, never surfaced. Instead, a cold, calculated sense of execution settled over my mind. They wanted to claim ownership of my assets. They wanted Bradley to be officially legally designated as the financial controller of this specific property and all accounts associated with it. By doing so under a fraudulently obtained guardianship order, they were not just trespassing. They were actively committing wire fraud, bank fraud, and felony theft of a federally protected asset. If Bradley legally tied his name to my estate as a conservator, he was attaching his already sinking criminal ship to an anchor made of solid lead. I looked at Bradley. I let a small, defeated smile cross my face, playing exactly into the role they expected. "You are absolutely certain you want to do this, Bradley?" I asked, my voice soft, almost hesitant. "You are absolutely certain you want to legally take full responsibility for managing all of my accounts and this property? You want your name on all the financial control documents?" Bradley puffed out his chest, his eyes gleaming with triumphant greed. "I am a financial expert, Maya. I am going to squeeze every single dime out of this place. I will manage your assets much better than your broken mind ever could. Consider it a permanent takeover." I looked at Chloe. She was practically vibrating with vindictive joy, standing over my bags like a conqueror claiming a fallen territory. She thought she had finally won. She thought she had erased my independence and secured her prize. I nodded slowly. I reached down and picked up my running shoes from the wet grass. I dusted off the dirt and tucked them under my arm. "Okay," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "If that is how you want to proceed, then I will leave you to it. Enjoy the house." I turned my back on them. I did not grab the rest of my bags. I did not look back at the beautiful wooden porch or the intricate stained glass windows my grandfather had loved so much. I simply walked down the driveway, climbed back into my sedan, and started the engine. As I put the car in drive, I looked through the rearview mirror. Chloe was laughing, kicking my duffel bag one last time before turning to walk inside the house. Bradley was clapping the locksmith on the shoulder, gesturing for him to finish breaking the lock. They were celebrating their hostile takeover, completely oblivious to the reality of their situation. They had just voluntarily legally inserted themselves into an active federal sting operation. By claiming financial conservatorship over my assets, Bradley had given the Internal Revenue Service full unmitigated authorization to audit every single transaction he made, moving forward and backward. He had essentially handed over his entire financial soul to the federal government. I pulled out of the neighborhood onto the main road. I picked up my secure phone from the passenger seat and dialed Director Vance. Agent Wilson Vance answered immediately. Status update. The targets have taken the bait, Director. I replied, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. Bradley Thornton just assumed illegal financial conservatorship over my primary residence and all associated bait accounts. We now have complete legal authorization to trace his immediate asset transfers without requiring additional subpoenas. He just unlocked the back door to his own offshore holding companies. Excellent work, Vance said, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. Let them get comfortable in the house. We will move to phase 2. I hung up the phone and merged onto the highway heading back toward downtown Atlanta. Chloe thought she was locking me in a psychiatric ward. In reality, she had just locked herself and her husband into a federal penitentiary. The hunt was no longer in the planning stages. I had officially pressed the button, and there was absolutely no turning back. I parked my sedan in the narrow alley behind the dilapidated brick building that housed my cover business. Maya's Freelance Tax Services was a modest setup designed to support my legend as an underachieving disappointment. I walked up the squeaky wooden stairs and unlocked the frosted glass door. The space was intentionally sparse, featuring a few battered filing cabinets, a cheap laminate desk, and a dying potted plant. It was the perfect contrast to Bradley's sleek glass and steel fortress in the financial district. I sat at my desk and pulled up the secondary monitoring software on my secure laptop, watching the digital breadcrumbs Bradley was already leaving across the financial network. He was moving fast, blindly transferring funds from my grandfather's estate to prop up his failing hedge fund. The heavy thud of footsteps on the wooden stairs broke my concentration. Before I could lock my screen, the frosted glass door swung open, hitting the wall with a sharp crack. Bradley stepped into the small office. He looked entirely out of place in his bespoke tailored suit and expensive Italian loafers. The smug satisfaction radiating from him was palpable. He closed the door behind him, turning the deadbolt with a deliberate metallic click. He surveyed my meager office with open disgust. "So this is where you hide," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It is exactly as pathetic as I imagined." I stood up slowly, making sure to keep my posture defensive. "What are you doing here, Bradley? You already took the house." He walked slowly toward my desk, closing the distance between us. "Taking the house was just the first step, Maya. I needed to make sure you understood your new reality. You have been a thorn in my side ever since Chloe and I got married. You sit there with your quiet judgments and your modest lifestyle pretending you are somehow better than us. But now I own you. Legally and financially, I control every aspect of your life." I backed away from the desk, letting my shoulders slump. I needed him to feel absolutely powerful. I needed him to monologue. My left hand moved instinctively toward my opposite wrist. With a subtle double tap against the face of my smartwatch, I activated the secure audio recording software. It was a specialized federal application that immediately began uploading encrypted audio directly to the secure server at headquarters. "You cannot do this," I said, injecting a slight tremor into my voice. "It is illegal. I will hire a lawyer. I will take you to court and prove I am perfectly capable of managing my own assets." Bradley laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound. He stepped around the desk, forcing me to retreat until my back hit the peeling wallpaper of the office corner. He leaned in, placing one hand on the wall beside my head, trapping me. He was close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the stale sweat of his underlying panic. "Listen," Maya Bradley whispered, his tone dropping into a vicious, hateful cadence. "This legal system is designed for white guys in suits like me. A black girl with a history of depression will never win in court. My firm manages hundreds of millions of dollars. How will you fight me? He leaned in closer, his eyes locked onto mine with absolute malice. You are nothing. You are a statistical anomaly who got lucky with a crazy grandfather's inheritance. Judges look at me and they see success. They see a peer. They look at you and they see exactly what I wrote in that petition. A broken, unstable mess. No one is coming to save you. I let my breath hitch. I forced my eyes to widen in manufactured terror and shrank back against the drywall. I made myself tremble, a physical manifestation of the broken victim he desperately needed me to be. Please, Bradley, I whispered, keeping my voice entirely submissive. Just leave me alone. Internally, my mind was perfectly cold and perfectly still. Every single word he just spoke was currently being digitized, encrypted, and stored on a federal server. He thought his race, his gender, and his stolen wealth were impenetrable armor. He was utterly blind to the fact that his arrogance had just handed a federal prosecutor a recorded admission of malicious intent and explicit bias. He was handing my agency the kind of slam-dunk evidence that juries despised and judges punished with maximum sentencing. Bradley smiled, savoring my apparent fear. You are going to sit quietly in your cheap little apartment, Maya. You are going to attend whatever psychiatric evaluations I schedule for you, and you are going to sign any piece of paper Chloe puts in front of you. If you even think about fighting this, I will drain every cent from that estate, paying for expert witnesses to declare you permanently incompetent. I will drag your name through the mud until you cannot even get a job bagging groceries. Do we understand each other? Yes, I stammered, staring at his expensive silk tie. I understand. Good, he sneered, stepping back and adjusting his cuffs. I am glad we had this little chat. I will send my assistant over later this week to collect your physical banking tokens and any hard copy documents related to the estate. Have them boxed up and ready. He turned and walked to the door, flipping the deadbolt open. He did not look back as he stepped out into the hallway and descended the stairs. I listened to his heavy footsteps fade away, followed by the roar of his luxury sports car starting in the alley below. As soon as the engine noise faded into the city traffic, I dropped the fragile facade. I straightened my posture, rolling my shoulders to release the manufactured tension. I tapped my smartwatch, ending the recording and verifying the successful upload receipt from the server. I walked back to my desk and sat down, bringing my secure laptop out of sleep mode. The audio file was already sitting in my secure inbox, ready to be processed into evidence. I tagged the file, categorized it under Bradley Thornton's primary target profile, and appended a note for Director Vance regarding the explicit nature of the threats. It was a beautiful piece of leverage. It proved coercion, intimidation, and civil rights violations, adding severe federal enhancements to the impending financial charges. Bradley's assumption of control was a strategic blunder of epic proportions. While he was busy threatening me in a dingy office, my federal team was already dissecting his morning transactions. By transferring funds from my grandfather's pristine, uncompromised estate accounts into his failing hedge fund, he had cross-contaminated his entire financial ecosystem. We no longer had to search for the hidden ledgers. He was actively writing the ledgers for us. I pulled up the tracing software. The red nodes on my screen representing his illegal transfers were multiplying rapidly. He was moving the money through a labyrinth of shell companies in Delaware, then routing it to offshore accounts in the Caymans, before bringing it back into his domestic firm, disguised as foreign investment capital. It was a classic money laundering technique, but it was incredibly sloppy. He was rushing. The liquidity crisis at his firm was clearly much worse than my initial estimates had indicated. He was bleeding cash, and my grandfather's estate was the only tourniquet he could find to stop the hemorrhage. I needed to maintain my cover just a little longer. I needed Bradley and Chloe to feel absolutely secure in their stolen victory. The higher they climbed on their mountain of arrogance, the harder the impact would be when the federal hammer finally fell. They needed to believe they had completely neutralized me, so they would continue making careless, desperate mistakes. I opened a secure communication channel to the tactical teams still monitoring the targets. Target Bradley Thornton has left my location, I typed. He is likely heading back to his corporate headquarters. Increase digital surveillance on his primary work terminals. He is initiating mass transfers, and I want every single keystroke logged. Capture all metadata. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing screens illuminating the dim office. Bradley genuinely thought his privilege and his designer suits gave him immunity from consequence. He thought the system was built to protect him and crush people like me. He was entirely convinced that his manufactured reality would overpower the truth. He was about to learn that the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division did not care about his pedigree, his race, or his country club memberships. We cared about the numbers. We cared about the data. And Bradley's numbers were drawing a straight, unbroken line directly to a federal cell block. The drive from my cover office to the hotel was a deliberate exercise in situational awareness. I took a circuitous route, making sure I was not being followed by any private investigators Bradley might have hired to monitor his newly appointed ward. With my grandfather's house currently occupied by my sister and her locksmith, and my office compromised by Bradley's little visit, I needed a clean, secure operational base. I arrived at a luxury corporate hotel in Midtown, checking into a corner suite under an established federal alias. The suite was spacious, anonymous, and entirely disconnected from Maya Wilson, the tragic failure. I swept the room for listening devices out of pure habit. Satisfied that the room was clean, I drew the heavy blackout curtains and dragged the heavy mahogany writing desk to the center of the room. From the false bottom of my overnight bag, I extracted my primary workstation. It was a matte black military-grade laptop, completely untraceable, and equipped with a multi-layered encryption protocol that would take a supercomputer a decade to crack. I booted the system, routing my connection through a secure proxy server in Geneva before bouncing it back to the federal network. The screen illuminated my face in the dim room as I initiated a secure video link to Washington, D.C. The connection established almost instantly. Director Vance appeared on the screen, sitting in his sterile office at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division headquarters. He looked tired, but his eyes were intensely focused. "Agent Wilson," he greeted, his voice crisp through the encrypted audio channel. "I received the audio file you uploaded from your cover office. The threatening language and explicit bias are enough for civil rights and extortion charges, but we need the financial architecture to bring down the entire syndicate. Tell me we have a clear path forward." "We have more than a path, Director," I replied, leaning closer to the microphone. "We have the master key." For 2 years, our task force had been painstakingly building a case against Bradley Thornton's Wall Street hedge fund. On paper, Bradley was a financial genius, delivering consistently impossible returns to his high-net-worth clients. In reality, his firm was nothing more than a glorified Ponzi scheme, cross-pollinated with a sophisticated international money laundering operation. He was taking clean money from Atlanta's elite, funneling it through a labyrinth of shell companies in the Cayman Islands, mixing it with illicit cartel cash, and paying out early investors with capital from new victims. My parents' logistics company was heavily entangled, serving as a domestic wash cycle for the physical cash. We knew he was guilty. We had the circumstantial data and the irregular trading patterns mapped out. But knowing it and proving it in federal court were two entirely different realities. Bradley was meticulous about compartmentalization. He kept the primary ledgers hidden behind layers of corporate secrecy laws and offshore banking protections. We had hit a massive brick wall. Without a direct link to the offshore accounts, we could not convince a federal judge to sign the search warrants required to breach his corporate servers. We were completely stalled, waiting for him to make a mistake. Until today. "Talk to me," Maya Vance said, leaning forward in his chair. "What exactly did he do?" "He took the bait," I explained, pulling up the probate court filings on my secondary monitor and sharing my screen with DC. "My sister and Bradley executed their emergency guardianship petition this morning. They legally evicted me from my grandfather's estate. Chloe is listed as the guardian of my person, but Bradley specifically petitioned to be appointed as the financial conservator over my assets. He wants total legal control of the $4 million property and the associated trust accounts. Vance frowned, studying the documents on his screen. They are stealing your inheritance in broad daylight. This is an egregious abuse of the probate system. But how does this solve our warrant issue? We still cannot look inside his corporate books without probable cause directly linking his firm to the fraud. I smiled, feeling the adrenaline hum through my veins. Because Bradley's arrogant superiority has blinded him to the basic rules of probate law. I typed a few commands, pulling up the Georgia legal code on fiduciary responsibilities. To finalize his appointment as my financial conservator and gain absolute access to my trust accounts, Bradley has to prove to the court that he is a fit and proper fiduciary, I explained. The court does not just hand over a multi-million-dollar estate to anyone who asks. To satisfy the judge and clear the final background checks, Bradley is legally mandated to submit a comprehensive sworn declaration of his own financial status. Vance went entirely silent on the other end of the line. The realization was hitting him. He has to submit his complete personal and corporate financial statements to the court. I continued, my voice steady and cold. He has to disclose all domestic and international business interests. He has to list his assets, his liabilities, and his operating capital to prove he is wealthy and stable enough to manage my estate. And because he is using his hedge fund's corporate credentials to justify his financial expertise, he has to attach the firm's audited balance sheets. He has to put it all on the public record, Vance said, his voice barely a whisper. Exactly. Under penalty of perjury. He is so desperate for the clean cash in my grandfather's trust to plug the massive holes in his Ponzi scheme that he is voluntarily walking into a trap. If he submits fraudulent documents to the probate court, it is a separate federal crime. If he submits his actual ledgers to prove his liquidity, he hands us the offshore accounts. The moment he files that disclosure packet to gain control of my money, he provides the exact probable cause we need to tear his entire operation to the ground. He is legally compelling himself to give us the evidence we have spent 2 years hunting, Vance stated, a slow smile spreading across his face. Agent Wilson. This is a textbook checkmate. When is the final hearing? The final approval hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I replied. Bradley and Chloe are moving as fast as possible to liquidate my assets before I can mount a legal defense. They think they have me backed into a corner, terrified and helpless. They think I am hiding in a motel room crying over my lost house. Let them think they have won. Vance ordered, his tone shifting into full command mode. Do not interfere with the probate hearing tomorrow. Let him file the paperwork. The second those financial disclosures hit the court docket, I will have the federal judge standing by to sign the search warrants. We will breach his corporate headquarters before he even leaves the courthouse. Copy that, Director. I will maintain my cover and monitor the court filings. I closed the connection and shut down the encrypted video link. The hotel room fell silent, save for the low hum of the air conditioning unit. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the glittering lights of the city. Somewhere out there, my sister was likely popping expensive champagne, celebrating her theft of my grandfather's house. Bradley was probably sitting in his luxury home office, arrogantly preparing the financial documents that would ultimately seal his doom. They had spent my entire life calling me a loser. They had dismissed my career, insulted my intelligence, and treated me like a disposable burden. They were so blinded by their own elite privilege and arrogant superiority that they never bothered to look past the surface. They never realized that the quiet, awkward girl they loved to humiliate had methodically evolved into their greatest predator. I pulled the blackout curtains shut and set my alarm for dawn. Tomorrow, the Wilson family would finally face the absolute devastation of their own making. The heavy silence of my hotel suite was shattered by a sharp, aggressive pounding on the solid oak door. I glanced at the digital clock on the nightstand. It was nearly midnight. I had been asleep for less than an hour. My federal instincts immediately kicked in. I slipped out of bed, pulling on a dark robe over my sleepwear, and moved silently toward the entryway. I checked the digital peephole monitor. Standing in the brightly lit hallway, looking entirely out of place in the sterile hotel environment, were my mother Vivian and my father Marcus. Flanking them was a tall, remarkably gaunt man clutching a thick leather medical briefcase. Bradley was far more resourceful than I had anticipated. He had clearly deployed his firm's private security contractors to track my sedan's license plate from my downtown office to the midtown parking garage. They were not content to wait for the morning probate hearing. They wanted to secure their prize tonight. I quickly walked back to the center of the room, ensuring my encrypted tactical laptop was fully concealed beneath the false bottom of my overnight bag. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow and my posture to shrink. I needed to become the terrified, erratic daughter they expected to find. I unbolted the door, opening it just a fraction. Vivian did not wait for an invitation. She slammed her palm against the wood, forcing the door wide open and stepping into my personal space with the aggressive entitlement of a monarch entering a conquered territory. Marcus followed closely behind, his face set in a rigid mask of paternal disappointment. The gaunt man stepped in last, closing the heavy door behind him and engaging the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. "Did you honestly believe you could hide from us in a hotel?" "Maya," Vivian sneered, her eyes darting around the luxurious suite with thinly veiled disgust. "You are acting like a paranoid child. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this family." I backed away from her, letting my shoulders round defensively. "How did you find me?" I asked, keeping my voice small and trembling, and Marcus crossed his arms, blocking the exit. "Bradley has resources, Maya. He cares about your well-being. We all do. That is exactly why we brought Dr. Sterling." The gaunt man stepped forward, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He did not offer his hand. He looked at me with the detached clinical gaze of a predator evaluating wounded prey. "Hello, Maya," he said, his voice a soft, condescending purr. "I am Dr. Sterling. Bradley retained my services to conduct an independent psychiatric evaluation of your current mental state. Your family is very concerned about your recent erratic behavior." I recognized the name immediately. Dr. Arthur Sterling was a notorious hired gun in the Atlanta legal circuit. He was a licensed psychiatrist who made a very lucrative living providing favorable medical testimony for wealthy clients in bitter custody disputes and hostile conservatorship battles. He was a man who sold medical diagnoses to the highest bidder. "You cannot evaluate me in a hotel room in the middle of the night," I protested, letting my breathing become shallow and rapid. "I have my own doctors. I'm perfectly fine." Dr. Sterling opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of medical forms. "Your own doctors have failed you, Maya. You are exhibiting classic signs of severe schizoaffective disorder compounded by paranoid delusions. You are isolating yourself from your support system. You are exhibiting hostility toward your caregivers. You are demonstrating an absolute inability to grasp the reality of your financial and personal vulnerabilities." He had diagnosed me within 30 seconds of meeting me without asking a single clinical question. It was a breathtaking violation of medical ethics. Vivian stepped closer, backing me into the edge of the heavy mahogany writing desk. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya," she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are going to stop fighting us. We have the emergency court order. We have the medical expert. If you make this difficult, we will not send you to the private luxury recovery center Bradley has graciously selected. I will personally make a phone call and have you involuntarily committed to a state psychiatric ward. Do you have any idea what they do to uncooperative patients in state facilities? They will strap you to a bed and pump you full of sedatives until you cannot remember your own name." Marcus stepped up beside her, looming over me to maximize the physical intimidation. "Do not test your mother, Maya. We are trying to handle this quietly to protect the family reputation. Bradley is stepping up to fix the financial mess you have made of your grandfather's estate. You are completely incompetent to manage that kind of wealth. You are going to sign the consent forms Dr. Sterling has prepared. You are going to legally acknowledge your mental instability and voluntarily surrender your autonomy to your sister and her husband." They had cornered me perfectly. They had engineered a scenario designed to break my spirit and force my compliance through sheer psychological terror. To a normal civilian, this would be an inescapable nightmare. To a federal agent running an active sting operation, it was a masterclass in self-incrimination. Dr. Sterling placed the paperwork on the desk and clicked a silver pen, offering it to me. "This document is a voluntary admission of psychiatric incompetence," he explained smoothly. "It officially designates Bradley Thornton as your permanent financial conservator and Chloe Thornton as your medical guardian. By signing this, you bypass the need for a contested court battle tomorrow morning. It is the best thing for everyone." I looked at the document. The legal language was absolute. It stripped away every single right I possessed as an American citizen, transferring my entire existence into Bradley's corrupt hands. If I signed it, Bradley would walk into the probate court at 9 in the morning, feeling completely invincible. He would confidently file his fraudulent hedge fund disclosures, believing I was completely neutralized and incapable of challenging his authority. He needed this signature to feel safe, and I needed him to feel safe so he would spring the trap. I looked up at Vivian, letting tears well in my eyes. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "Please do not do this to me. I will do whatever you want. Just do not lock me away." Vivian smiled, a cold, victorious expression that chilled me to the bone. She reached out and patted my cheek with patronizing affection. "That is a good girl, Maya. Just sign the paper and let the adults handle the difficult things." I took the silver pen from Dr. Sterling. My hand was visibly shaking as I pressed the tip to the paper. I signed my name on the designated line, my signature jagged and erratic. I signed away my house, my trust fund, and my freedom. Dr. Sterling smoothly pulled the document away, sliding it back into his leather briefcase. "Excellent," he murmured. "A transport team will arrive tomorrow afternoon to escort you to the residential facility. I highly recommend you pack your bags and wait quietly." Marcus and Vivian did not say goodbye. They simply turned and walked out of the room, following the corrupt doctor into the hallway. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, leaving me alone in the dim hotel suite. I stood perfectly still for 10 seconds, listening to their footsteps fade down the carpeted corridor. Once I was absolutely certain they were gone, the manufactured tears stopped instantly. My shaking hands steadied, my posture straightened. I walked over to the mahogany desk and pulled the encrypted tactical laptop from my overnight bag. I flipped open the screen and initiated a secure upload sequence to the IRS Criminal Investigation Server. I had activated the audio recording software on my smartphone the moment I checked the peephole. The entire terrifying interaction, Vivian's threats, Marcus's coercion, and Dr. Sterling's fraudulent medical diagnosis, was already digitized. I attached a priority flag to the audio file, directing it to Director Vance and the federal prosecutor assigned to our task force. Dr. Arthur Sterling was about to lose his medical license and face severe federal charges for medical fraud and extortion. My parents had just added kidnapping conspiracy and psychological abuse to their impending indictment. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had backed a helpless victim into a corner and forced her to surrender. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded weapon directly to their executioner. I glanced at the digital clock. It was 1 in the morning. Bradley would be at the courthouse in exactly 8 hours, armed with my forced signature and his fraudulent financial ledgers. He was walking straight into the slaughterhouse. I powered down the laptop, climbed back into bed, and closed my eyes, finally ready to get some sleep. The trap was set, the bait was swallowed, and tomorrow the hunt would finally conclude. The morning sun pierced through the gap in the heavy blackout curtains, casting a sharp slice of light across the mahogany desk. I was already awake, dressed in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that I usually reserved for federal court appearances. The terrified, erratic daughter from last night was gone. Agent Maya Wilson was ready for work. At precisely 7:30, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the suite. I tapped my smartwatch, activating the encrypted audio recorder for a second time. I walked to the door and pulled it open without checking the monitor. Marcus stood in the hallway alone. He was dressed in a pristine navy suit, holding a steaming cup of expensive coffee. He looked relaxed, victorious, and entirely condescending. Vivian was likely already at the courthouse with Bradley, waiting for the judge to rubber stamp my demise. Marcus had been sent to handle the cleanup. "Are your bags packed, Maya?" he asked, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. "The transport team from the facility will be here in an hour. I decided to come personally to ensure you do not try anything foolish. We are doing this quietly and with dignity." I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, locking us inside. I did not move toward my overnight bag. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms and staring directly into his eyes. My posture was rigid, my expression completely devoid of the fear he expected. "I am not packing anything, Marcus," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And I am certainly not going to any facility." His confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second before hardening into a scowl. "Do not start this again, Maya. You signed the documents last night. Dr. Sterling declared you incompetent. You have absolutely no legal standing to refuse. Bradley is filing the guardianship paperwork as we speak. If you force me to physically drag you down to the lobby, I will do it." He took a step forward, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. The tactic might have worked on the broken daughter he thought he had raised. It had zero effect on a trained federal agent. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I held my ground and let a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. "You do not care about my mental health, Marcus," I stated, cutting through his bluster with absolute precision. "You do not care about my well-being or my supposed illness. This entire theatrical performance has absolutely nothing to do with me being a danger to myself." I took a deliberate step toward him, forcing him to stop his advance. "This is about the $4 million sitting in a clean, untraceable trust account. You need my cash to cover Bradley's illegal investment holes, right?" Marcus froze. His eyes widened slightly, the coffee cup in his hand trembling just enough to spill a drop onto the pristine carpet. "How do you?" The words caught in his throat. He quickly recovered his shock, morphing into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. He slammed his coffee cup onto the nearest side table, splashing the dark liquid across the polished wood. "You have no idea what you are talking about," he growled, taking another aggressive step forward. "You are delusional. This is exactly why you need to be committed." "I am not delusional," I countered, my voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. "I know exactly what is happening inside that hedge fund. Bradley is running a massive liquidity deficit. He is moving dirty money through offshore shell companies, and your logistics firm is serving as his domestic washing machine. You are bleeding cash and the walls are closing in. You realize that my grandfather's estate was the only pristine asset left in this entire family. You need my money to prop up the Ponzi scheme before the whole house of cards collapses." The silence in the hotel suite was deafening. I watched the realization wash over Marcus' face. He was staring at me as if he were looking at a stranger. The timid, compliant scapegoat was gone. In her place was a woman who had just accurately dismantled his entire criminal enterprise in under 30 seconds. But Marcus was a man entirely blinded by his own narcissism. He had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, believing that his wealth and status made him immune to consequence. Instead of recognizing the extreme danger he was in, his arrogance overrode his survival instincts. He felt cornered, and like a cornered animal, he lashed out. "So what?" he roared, his voice echoing violently off the walls of the suite. "So what if we need the money? You are my daughter. You owe this family everything you have. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. We clothed you. You are nothing without the Wilson name." He pointed a trembling finger at my chest, his face flushed dark red with fury. "Bradley is the only thing keeping this family afloat. He is helping me wash tax liabilities that would ruin me. He is protecting my legacy. You have contributed absolutely nothing to our success. You sit around painting your little pictures and living your pathetic, mediocre life while we build an empire." I kept my expression entirely neutral, letting him dig his grave deeper with every single word. "You are a Wilson," Marcus shouted, closing the distance between us until he was inches from my face. "You must sacrifice to save this family's honor. It is your duty. You do not deserve that inheritance. My father should have left that estate to me to protect our investments. Instead, he gave it to his broken, unstable disappointment of a daughter. We are simply correcting his mistake. Bradley needs that capital today to satisfy offshore clients who do not tolerate delays. You will obediently hand over the money, Maya. You will go to that facility, and you will keep your mouth shut while we fix this. I stared back at him, feeling a profound sense of closure. For years, I had wondered if there was any genuine love buried beneath their toxic ambition. I had wondered if my parents ever truly saw me as a human being rather than a flawed asset. Marcus had just given me the absolute, undeniable truth. I lifted my left arm, casually brushing a piece of invisible lint from my lapel. My smartwatch blinked, confirming the audio file was actively streaming to the secure server in Washington. "Let me make sure I understand you correctly, Marcus," I said, speaking clearly into the hidden microphone. "You are explicitly admitting that you and Bradley Thornton are actively engaged in criminal tax evasion and money laundering. You are admitting that you orchestrated a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation to illegally seize control of my assets to cover your financial crimes. And you are doing this to satisfy offshore clients." Marcus sneered, leaning in close. "I am admitting that I am the head of this family, and I do what needs to be done to protect my wealth. Who are you going to tell Maya? The doctors think you are crazy. The judge thinks you are incompetent. No one is going to believe a word you say. You have no power here." My phone buzzed in my pocket, a single sharp vibration. It was the signal from Director Vance. Bradley had just officially filed the guardianship paperwork and his falsified financial ledgers with the probate court. The trap had snapped shut. The federal judge had just signed the search warrants. I smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile that caused Marcus to instinctively take a step back. "You are right about one thing, Marcus," I said, dropping the civilian persona completely and slipping into the clipped, authoritative cadence of an active federal agent. "I am not going to tell anyone. I do not have to." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. I flipped it open, holding it up so Marcus could clearly see the silver badge and the federal credentials secured inside. The seal of the Department of the Treasury gleamed in the morning light. "Agent Maya Wilson," I stated, watching the color completely drain from my father's face. "Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division." Marcus stared at the badge, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. His eyes darted from the federal credentials to my face, searching for the punchline of a joke that did not exist. He staggered backward, his knees hitting the edge of the sofa behind him. "What?" he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" "This is the end of the line," I replied, stepping forward and commanding the space in the room. For the past 2 years, my task force has been mapping the exact architecture of Bradley's fraud. We knew about the Cayman accounts. We knew about your logistics firm washing the cash. We had everything except the direct probable cause needed to breach his secure servers. Marcus sank onto the sofa, looking like a man who had just been shot. "You," he gasped. "You set us up." I shook my head. "No, Marcus. You set yourselves up. Your greed and your absolute disdain for me made you reckless. You thought I was weak. You thought I was stupid. You thought you could orchestrate a fraudulent guardianship to steal my grandfather's clean money. In order to get that guardianship approved, Bradley legally compelled himself to file his financial disclosures with the probate court at 9:00 this morning. I checked my watch. It is now 9:14. Bradley just submitted a mountain of falsified financial documents to a federal judge under penalty of perjury. That gave my agency the exact probable cause we needed." Marcus buried his face in his hands, a low moan escaping his throat. Right now, I continued, my voice relentless. 3 tactical teams of federal agents are kicking down the doors of Bradley's hedge fund headquarters in the financial district. They are seizing his servers, his hard drives, and his physical ledgers. A second team is currently raiding your logistics firm. A third team is waiting for Bradley outside the probate courtroom. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, letting them dangle from my fingers. The metallic clink sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet hotel room. "You wanted to know who I was going to tell Marcus. I am not telling anyone. I am just the agent assigned to collect the evidence." And you just gave me a recorded comprehensive confession to multiple federal crimes, including tax evasion, money laundering, and extortion. Stand up, Marcus, I commanded, my voice echoing with federal authority. Put your hands behind your back, you are under arrest. Marcus' chest heaved as the echo of his confession bounced off the walls of the hotel suite. He had just admitted to federal tax fraud, money laundering, and the exploitation of a vulnerable family member out loud. The sheer arrogant stupidity of his outburst hung in the air, a tangible admission of guilt. Vivian recognized the danger of his unhinged rant instantly. The aggressive mask she had worn since kicking the door open melted away in a fraction of a second, entirely replaced by a grotesque display of maternal sorrow. She stepped directly between Marcus and me, raising a trembling hand to her mouth. Her eyes widened and she forced a wet, choked sob from her throat. "Oh, Maya," she cried, her voice cracking with perfectly manufactured devastation. "Please look at what this illness is doing to you. It is tearing our family apart. Your father is just exhausted from worrying about you. We all are." She stepped closer, reaching out to gently grasp my shoulders. Her touch felt like ice, but I forced myself to lean into it. I needed to give them exactly what they came for. "We do not want to fight you, sweetheart," Vivian whispered, letting a single strategically produced tear slide down her powdered cheek. "We just want our daughter back. Bradley has arranged for a beautiful private facility in the mountains. It has gardens and art therapy and everything you need to finally heal. But you have to let us help you. You have to stop resisting. Just sign the paperwork, Maya. Let us carry this burden for you so you can finally rest." I let my knees buckle exactly enough to sell a complete psychological collapse. I sank heavily into the chair behind the mahogany desk, burying my face in my hands. I forced my shoulders to shake, pulling ragged, uneven breaths into my lungs. Through the gaps in my fingers, I watched Vivian exchange a swift, victorious glance with Marcus. They thought they had finally broken the wild horse. They thought the pressure had shattered my mind. "I cannot do this anymore," I sobbed, keeping my face hidden. "I just want it to stop." "Then let it stop," Vivian cooed, slipping the heavy legal document from the folder and sliding it across the polished wood of the desk. She placed the silver pen directly into my trembling hand. "Just your signature right here at the bottom, Maya. That is all it takes to make the pain go away." I kept my head bowed, letting a stray tear drop onto the expensive parchment. I gripped the pen with white knuckles, ensuring my hand shook visibly. With slow, agonizing deliberation, I pressed the silver tip to the signature line. I crafted the signature perfectly matching the erratic, deteriorated handwriting of someone suffering from a severe schizoaffective episode. It was a messy, jagged scrawl that legally surrendered my autonomy, my $4 million estate, and my entire future to Bradley Thornton. The absolute second the pen lifted from the paper, the maternal sorrow vanished from Vivian's face. She snatched the document off the desk with the speed and precision of a striking viper. There were no more tears. The trembling in her voice was entirely gone. She quickly inspected the jagged signature, blew on the wet ink to dry it, and slipped the paper securely into her designer handbag. She looked down at me, still slumped in the chair, and let out a cold, dismissive scoff. "Have your bags packed by noon tomorrow?" Vivian ordered, her tone reverting to absolute ice. "The transport team will not tolerate delays, and I will not pay them overtime because you cannot follow simple instructions." Marcus adjusted his tie, casting one final look of profound disgust in my direction. "You brought this on yourself," he muttered. They turned in unison and walked out of the suite. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, and I heard the deadbolt engage, trapping me inside. I remained slumped in the chair for exactly 30 seconds, listening intently until the faint sound of their footsteps vanished entirely down the carpeted hallway. Once the silence was absolute, I sat up straight. I wiped the single tear from my cheek and dropped the terrified victim persona like a discarded coat. My breathing steadied, my pulse leveled, and my mind shifted back into sharp, tactical focus. I reached up to the collar of my dark silk blouse. My fingers brushed against the second button from the top. To the naked eye, it was a standard polished onyx button, perfectly matching the garment. In reality, it was a biometric high-definition federal surveillance lens equipped with an integrated parabolic microphone. It was active streaming and directly linked to the secure servers at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I tapped the side of my smartwatch, opening the encrypted comms channel to Washington. Director Vance. I said, my voice crisp and authoritative in the empty room. Please confirm receipt of the audio-visual stream. Vance's voice crackled through the secure earpiece hidden deep in my left ear canal. Confirming receipt. Agent Wilson. He replied, a distinct note of triumph coloring his usual stoic tone. We have the video of the coercion. We have the visual of the fraudulent signature. And we have Marcus Wilson's unredacted high-definition confession to money laundering and international tax evasion. It is a flawless capture. I stood up from the desk and walked over to the window, pulling back the edge of the blackout curtain to look down at the street below. I watched Marcus and Vivian emerge from the hotel lobby and slide into the back of a waiting black town car. They looked so confident, so incredibly secure in their victory. They had the signature they needed. They thought they had secured their financial salvation by sacrificing their own flesh and blood. Bradley will file that document with the probate court the second the clerk's office opens tomorrow, I told Vance, keeping my eyes on the departing town car. He needs that specific piece of paper to validate his conservatorship and gain access to the grandfather's trust. Once he submits it, he triggers the federal wire fraud and perjury traps. The net is set, Maya Vance confirmed. Our tactical teams are in position outside Bradley's corporate headquarters and your father's logistics firm. The federal judge has reviewed the live feed and is pre-signing the search and seizure warrants as we speak. You played your part perfectly. Get some rest. Tomorrow we execute the takedown. I closed the comms channel and let the heavy curtain fall back into place, plunging the room back into darkness. My family had spent a lifetime treating me as a socially unfit liability. They had weaponized my quiet nature and manipulated my history to paint me as a helpless tragedy. They thought my silence was weakness. They had no idea that my silence was actually observation. I had watched them. I had learned their patterns, their greed, and their arrogant blind spots. They wanted a victim who would quietly sign away her life to protect their crimes. Instead, they got a federal agent who just handed the Department of Justice the exact rope needed to hang their entire criminal empire. I unbuttoned the silk blouse, carefully placing the surveillance lens into my secure case. The game of shadows was over. Tomorrow morning, the illusion of the wealthy, untouchable Wilson family would shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Probate Court swung open precisely at 8:45 the next morning. I sat quietly at the defendant's table, keeping my head bowed and my hands folded neatly in my lap. I wore a simple, inexpensive beige cardigan over a plain white blouse, projecting the exact image of a defeated, fragile woman who had completely surrendered to her fate. The air in the courtroom shifted as my family made their grand entrance. They did not just walk into the room, they invaded it with the blinding entitlement of A-list celebrities arriving at a red carpet premiere. My mother, Vivian, led the procession, wearing a pristine cream-colored Chanel suit and a string of South Sea pearls that practically glowed under the fluorescent lights. Marcus walked beside her, projecting the stoic sorrow of a patriarch burdened by a tragic family duty. My sister Chloe trailed slightly behind them, draped in head-to-toe Gucci, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. She held a tissue a fraction of an inch from her dry eyes, performing the role of the devastated sibling to absolute perfection. Then came Bradley. He strode down the center aisle like a conquering king returning to his throne room. He wore a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit that cost more than my cover business earned in a year. A platinum Rolex peeked out from his tailored cuff, a deliberate signal of his immense wealth and untouchable status. He was flanked by 3 high-powered corporate litigators from one of the most expensive law firms in Atlanta. They carried thick leather briefcases and radiated an aura of absolute legal superiority. As they took their places at the plaintiff's table across the aisle, Bradley cast a brief sidelong glance in my direction. His lips curled into a faint, victorious smirk. He looked at me with the absolute disdain of a predator observing a trapped insect. He thought the game was already over. I kept my gaze fixed on the table in front of me, maintaining my subdued persona. Beside me sat a man in a rumpled-off-the-rack gray suit. He had a receding hairline, thick glasses, and a completely unremarkable face. To Bradley and his team of elite lawyers, the man looked like a cheap public defender or a bottom-tier legal aid assigned to process my surrender. In reality, the man sitting next to me was Special Prosecutor Arthur Hayes, one of the most ruthless and brilliant legal minds in the Department of Justice. He was the federal point man for our task force, and he was currently playing the role of an incompetent, small-time lawyer with Oscar-worthy precision. He slouched in his chair, shuffling a few disorganized papers, and occasionally adjusting his glasses as if the opulent presence of Bradley's legal team completely intimidated him. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and Judge Harrison, a stern woman with a reputation for zero tolerance, took her seat at the bench. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the massive stack of files already prepped for the morning session. "We are here to review the emergency petition for the guardianship and financial conservatorship of Maya Wilson," Judge Harrison announced, her voice cutting through the quiet courtroom. "I see we have a full house this morning. Counsel, you may proceed." Bradley's lead attorney, a slick, silver-haired man named Sterling Vance, stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. He approached the podium with practiced grace, exuding a sickeningly compassionate tone. "Your Honor, we are here today on a deeply tragic but necessary family matter." He began, his voice echoing with manufactured sympathy. "We represent Bradley and Chloe Thornton, the brother-in-law and biological sister of the respondent Maya Wilson. We are petitioning for immediate and total conservatorship over Maya's personal and financial affairs." The lawyer paused, letting the silence stretch for dramatic effect. He turned slightly, gesturing toward where I sat, looking small and pathetic next to Prosecutor Hayes. "Your Honor, it brings this family no joy to stand before you today," the lawyer continued, shaking his head sorrowfully. "But Maya Wilson is suffering from a rapid and severe mental decline. Over the past several months, she has exhibited extreme paranoia, erratic behavior, and a total detachment from reality. She has isolated herself from her loving family and demonstrated a complete inability to manage her basic daily needs, let alone the complex financial responsibilities of a $4 million estate recently left to her by her late grandfather." Judge Harrison flipped open a file on her desk. "These are serious allegations, Counselor. I assume you have the medical documentation to substantiate this sudden need for an emergency intervention." "Absolutely, Your Honor," the slick lawyer replied, pulling a sealed envelope from his briefcase. "Just last night, Maya's family attempted a desperate intervention. They located her hiding in a midtown hotel room, suffering from a severe paranoid episode. They brought a licensed psychiatric professional, Dr. Arthur Sterling, to evaluate her condition." The lawyer handed the envelope to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "Inside that envelope, you will find Dr. Sterling's sworn medical evaluation," the lawyer stated confidently. "He has officially diagnosed Maya with severe schizoaffective disorder compounded by acute paranoid delusions. He explicitly states that she is a danger to herself and entirely incompetent to make legal or financial decisions. Furthermore, Your Honor, you will find a voluntary consent form signed by Maya herself during a moment of clarity last night, legally surrendering her autonomy to her sister and brother-in-law. She knows she needs help, Your Honor. She is begging for it." I kept my eyes glued to the table, forcing my hands to tremble slightly. I could feel Vivian and Chloe staring at me, soaking in my apparent public humiliation. They were relishing every single second of this character assassination. They were entirely convinced that their bought and paid-for doctor had provided an impenetrable legal shield for their theft. Judge Harrison reviewed the fraudulent documents, her expression neutral. She looked over at my table. "Does the respondent have legal representation today?" Prosecutor Hayes stood up awkwardly, knocking a pen off the table in the process. He scrambled to pick it up, offering a meek, apologetic smile. "Yes, Your Honor," he stammered, pushing his thick glasses up his nose. "I am representing Miss Wilson today," And does your client contest the medical evaluation or the signature on this consent form, counselor? The judge asked, peering over her glasses. Prosecutor Hayes cleared his throat, looking nervously at Bradley's imposing legal team. No, Your Honor, he said, his voice lacking any authority. My client does not contest the documents submitted by the petitioners. A collective silent sigh of relief washed over the plaintiff's table. Bradley leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs at the knee, his posture radiating absolute triumph. He had won. The pathetic little sister had surrendered without firing a single shot. Very well, Judge Harrison said, setting the medical file aside. The court acknowledges the medical necessity for intervention. However, this petition specifically requests that Bradley Thornton be granted total control over a highly liquid multi-million-dollar estate. The court takes fiduciary responsibility very seriously, Mr. Thornton. Appointing you as the sole financial conservator requires absolute proof of your own financial stability and expertise. Bradley stood up, buttoning his suit jacket and walking to the podium. He practically pushed his own lawyer out of the way, eager to claim his crowning moment. He looked up at the judge with a blinding, charismatic smile. Your Honor, I completely understand the court's diligence, Bradley said, his voice smooth and commanding. As the managing partner and CEO of Vanguard Financial Management, I oversee hundreds of millions of dollars in client assets daily. I am uniquely qualified to protect and grow Maya's inheritance, ensuring it is used exclusively for her long-term medical care. To satisfy the court's requirements, he continued, gesturing to his legal team. I have prepared a comprehensive financial disclosure packet. This includes my personal asset declarations, my certified tax returns, and the fully audited corporate balance sheets for my hedge fund. These documents represent total transparency, Your Honor. They prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that I possess the pristine liquidity and the unblemished financial history required to manage this estate. His lead lawyer hoisted 3 massive leather-bound binders onto the bailiff's desk. The sheer volume of the paperwork was designed to intimidate, to visually represent a mountain of legitimate wealth. I submit these financial ledgers to the court under penalty of perjury, Bradley announced, his voice ringing with arrogant finality. I swear that they represent a complete and accurate accounting of my personal and corporate financial status. I kept my head bowed, but a cold electric thrill shot through my nervous system. There it was, the golden ticket, the absolute point of no return. Bradley had just willingly, legally, and publicly handed the federal government the exact fabricated ledgers he used to hide his money laundering operation. He had locked his own prison cell from the inside and handed the key directly to the judge. Judge Harrison looked at the massive binders, then looked down at Bradley. You understand, Mr. Thornton, that by submitting these documents to this court to gain control of another citizen's assets, you are swearing to their absolute accuracy. Any misrepresentation or omission in these ledgers constitutes a severe violation of the law. Bradley did not even blink. He was so insulated by his own privilege, so convinced of his own invincibility that the warning did not even register. I understand completely, Your Honor, he replied, a patronizing edge creeping into his tone. My firm operates with the highest standards of integrity. You will find those ledgers are absolutely flawless. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. She picked up her gavel, her eyes drifting momentarily toward Prosecutor Hayes, who offered a virtually imperceptible nod in return. The court accepts these financial disclosures into the official public record, Judge Harrison stated, bringing the gavel down with a sharp, definitive crack. The sound of the wood hitting the sounding block echoed through the silent room. For Bradley, it was the sound of ultimate victory. For Vivian and Marcus, it was the sound of their financial salvation. But for me, sitting quietly in my cheap beige cardigan, it was the sound of the trap snapping shut. Bradley turned away from the podium, flashing a brilliant smile at Chloe. He smoothed his expensive tie and began walking back to his seat, ready to accept his new $4 million prize. He was completely unaware that the countdown clock had just hit 0. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had their probable cause. The warrants were active and the federal hammer was already in mid-swing. Bradley settled back into his plush leather chair, smoothing the lapels of his bespoke suit. He exchanged a sickeningly triumphant look with Vivian, who was already dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, putting on a show for the gallery. The three high-priced corporate litigators began casually packing their Mont Blanc pens and legal pads into their briefcases. The battle was over. The surrender was absolute. They were simply waiting to be dismissed. "Just a moment," Judge Harrison said, her voice slicing through the premature celebration. The rustling of papers stopped instantly. Bradley's lead attorney, Sterling Vance, paused, his hand hovering over the brass clasp of his briefcase. He looked up, a practiced, polite smile instantly plastered across his face. "Yes, Your Honor," Vance asked. "While I have accepted the financial disclosures into the record," the judge continued, tapping her pen against the heavy mahogany block, "I cannot finalize an involuntary conservatorship of this magnitude without corroborating sworn testimony from the family patriarch. This court requires absolute certainty before stripping a citizen of their fundamental rights. I need Marcus Wilson on the stand." Vivian patted Marcus on the arm, offering him an encouraging nod. Marcus stood up, puffing out his chest and buttoning his navy suit jacket. He walked toward the witness stand with the measured, dignified stride of a man entirely comfortable with wielding power. He placed his left hand on the Bible, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He had no idea he had just strapped himself into the electric chair. Vance approached the podium, projecting an aura of deep, respectful sympathy. "Mr. Wilson," the lawyer began, his tone gentle and coaxing, "can you describe for the court the events that led your family to seek this emergency intervention for your daughter Maya?" Marcus gripped the edges of the witness stand, adopting a somber, deeply pained expression. "It breaks my heart to be sitting here," he said, his voice dropping an octave to convey artificial paternal sorrow. "Maya has always been a fragile girl, but over the past few weeks, her mental state has rapidly deteriorated. She has become completely detached from reality. We tried to handle this privately to protect her dignity, but last night we realized she is an active danger to herself and to the legacy her grandfather left behind." "And how exactly did these delusions manifest?" Mr. Wilson Vance prompted, feeding him the exact script they had rehearsed. Marcus could not help himself. His innate arrogance pushed him to twist the knife. "He wanted to publicly humiliate me one last time to ensure everyone in that courtroom knew I was crazy. He looked directly at me, sitting quietly beside Prosecutor Hayes, and let a look of profound pity wash over his face. My daughter has lost her mind, Your Honor." Marcus stated, his voice echoing clearly across the vast room. "She is suffering from severe paranoia. Last night, when we tried to get her medical help, she began ranting about insane, absurd conspiracies. She suffers from the absolute delusion that my son-in-law Bradley is somehow involved in fraud." He shook his head, letting out a heavy theatrical sigh. She stood there shaking and crying, claiming that Bradley, a highly respected financier, was orchestrating some massive money laundering operation. She even accused me of being involved, claiming my logistics firm was part of this imaginary criminal enterprise. It was the frantic raving of a woman who has completely lost her grip on reality. "She needs to be institutionalized, Your Honor. She is not well." Vance turned back to the judge, spreading his hands in a gesture of helpless finality. "I believe that paints a clear picture, Your Honor. The respondent is suffering from extreme paranoid delusions. She is accusing her own family of federal crimes without a shred of evidence. We respectfully request you sign the final order." Judge Harrison did not sign the order. She did not reach for her pen. She sat perfectly still, staring at Marcus Wilson with an unblinking, analytical gaze. The silence in the courtroom stretched from a brief pause into an uncomfortable, suffocating void. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning vents. Vance cleared his throat, his polite smile faltering slightly. "Your Honor." Judge Harrison held up a single hand, silencing the elite lawyer instantly. She turned her attention back to Marcus. "Mr. Wilson," the judge said, her voice dangerously calm. "You are under oath. You are testifying before a federal court that these accusations of money laundering and fraud are the baseless fabrications of a mentally incompetent woman. You are testifying that your son-in-law's financial ledgers, which he just submitted under penalty of perjury, are entirely legitimate. Is that correct? Marcus sat up straighter, offended that he was even being questioned. Absolutely, Your Honor. My daughter is delusional. My son-in-law runs a pristine operation. Any suggestion otherwise is pure insanity. Judge Harrison slowly lowered her hand. She turned her gaze to the far right edge of her heavy oak bench. Sitting there entirely ignored by Bradley's legal team for the past 30 minutes was a thick, heavy manila folder. It was sealed with a bright red, highly visible Department of Justice stamp. The judge reached over and pulled the red-stamped folder directly into the center of her desk. She broke the federal seal with a sharp, tearing sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. She then reached for the massive leather-bound binders Bradley had proudly submitted just moments ago. She placed Bradley's immaculate fraudulent ledgers side by side with the contents of the red-stamped federal file. She opened Bradley's binder. She opened the DOJ file. She looked at the first page of Bradley's corporate balance sheet. Then she looked at a corresponding document from the federal file. She turned a page in Bradley's binder. She turned a page in the federal file. The agonizing, methodical rustle of paper was the only sound in the room. Bradley shifted in his seat. The victorious smirk had entirely vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, creeping unease. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on the red-stamped file on the judge's desk. Next to him, Vivian's hand dropped away from her pearls. Chloe lowered her tissue, her fake tears forgotten. Vance, the lead litigator, stepped forward slightly, his brow furrowed. Your Honor, if there is a discrepancy in the filing, we can certainly clarify. Sit down, Mr. Vance. Judge Harrison snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Vance sat down immediately, the color draining from his face. Judge Harrison slowly removed her reading glasses, folding them, and placing them carefully on top of Bradley's fabricated ledgers. She clasped her hands together, resting them on the federal file. She looked directly at Marcus, who was still sitting in the witness stand, his confident posture beginning to visibly crumble. Then she shifted her piercing, uncompromising gaze across the aisle, locking eyes with Bradley. The tension in the room was absolute. It felt as though the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the air. Mr. Thornton. Judge Harrison said, her voice cold, flat, and echoing with absolute authority. Mr. Wilson, I have just reviewed the sworn financial disclosures you submitted to this court to prove your fiduciary competence. I am currently comparing them to a certified active case file provided directly to my chambers this morning by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Bradley stopped breathing. Marcus gripped the railing of the witness box, his knuckles turning stark white. Judge Harrison leaned forward, her eyes boring into the two men. Do you truly know nothing? The question hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating weight. Do you truly know nothing? Judge Harrison repeated, her voice rising in volume and intensity. Because according to these federal documents, the delusions your daughter supposedly suffers from are in fact verified, mapped, and heavily documented realities. The offshore Cayman accounts she allegedly fabricated exist. The shell companies she supposedly hallucinated are actively trading. And the money laundering operation you just swore under oath was pure insanity is currently the subject of a massive multi-agency federal raid. Bradley's chair scraped violently against the marble floor as he pushed himself backward. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. His three high-powered corporate lawyers were frozen, staring at the judge in absolute horrified shock. They had just facilitated the submission of perjured documents to a federal judge. Their careers were effectively over. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but only a strangled wheezing sound came out. He looked wildly around the courtroom, his eyes finally locking onto me. I did not look away. I did not cower. I sat perfectly still, my posture flawless, my expression entirely composed. The fragile, broken woman in the beige cardigan was gone. I let the absolute weight of what I had done wash over him. I let him realize that the daughter he had spent a lifetime treating as a pathetic failure had just systematically and flawlessly destroyed his entire life. Beside me, Prosecutor Hayes casually removed his thick glasses. The bumbling, incompetent persona vanished instantly. He sat up straight, his shoulders broad, his demeanor radiating the lethal precision of a senior federal prosecutor. He reached into his rumpled gray suit jacket and pulled out a stack of sealed federal indictments, dropping them onto the table with a heavy definitive thud. The heavy definitive thud of the sealed indictments hitting the mahogany table seemed to break the spell that had paralyzed the courtroom. The man everyone had dismissed as a bottom-tier public defender stood up. He did not rush. He moved with the terrifying, deliberate grace of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal the unmistakable glint of a gold federal shield. "I am Special Agent Arthur Hayes of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he announced, his voice booming with absolute authority, replacing the meek stutter he had utilized just moments before. "I am the lead investigator for the joint task force between the FBI and the Department of the Treasury, and the woman sitting beside me is not suffering from schizoaffective disorder. She is not having paranoid delusions. She is Special Agent Maya Wilson, Forensic Auditor for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Bradley's lead attorney, Sterling Vance, physically recoiled, dropping his expensive pen as if it had suddenly caught fire. His two co-counsels scrambled backward, gripping the edges of their table. They looked at the massive binders of financial disclosures they had just submitted with absolute, unadulterated horror, realizing they had just facilitated the delivery of highly classified criminal evidence directly into federal hands. I stood up slowly. I did not rush. I let the beige cardigan slip from my shoulders, draping it over the back of my chair. I straightened my posture, discarding the hunched, terrified demeanor I had weaponized for the past 48 hours. I looked across the aisle at my family. Vivian was clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the strand looked ready to snap. Her perfectly powdered face had drained of all color, leaving her looking hollow and aged. Chloe was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly as her brain short-circuited, trying to process the impossibility of the situation. Her designer tissue fluttered to the floor, completely forgotten. But my focus was entirely on Bradley. The arrogant, invincible hedge fund manager was currently hyperventilating. His bespoke suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. Sweat beaded on his forehead, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. "Thank you, brother-in-law," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the courtroom, loud and crystal clear. Bradley blinked rapidly, his jaw trembling. What he choked out. I took a slow, deliberate step out from behind the defendant's table. I said, "Thank you, Bradley. We have been hunting you for 2 years. We knew exactly what you were doing. We knew about the phantom shell companies in the Cayman Islands. We knew about the falsified trading algorithms you used to mask the massive liquidity deficit in your primary fund. We knew you were running a textbook Ponzi scheme using new investor capital to pay off early investors while skimming millions off the top to fund your lavish lifestyle." I stepped closer to the center aisle, holding his panicked gaze. We knew everything. But knowing and proving are two entirely different things in a court of law. Your servers were encrypted. Your offshore accounts were shielded by international banking privacy laws. We needed direct, unimpeachable, probable cause to breach your network and seize your physical ledgers. We needed a catastrophic, unforced error. We needed you to voluntarily hand us the keys to your own destruction. Bradley swallowed hard, a terrible wheezing sound escaping his lungs. You set me up," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You faked the breakdown. You faked the illness." "I did not fake your greed, Bradley," I countered, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "I just gave it a target. We knew your fund was collapsing. We knew Marcus was using his logistics company to help you wash the dirty money to cover the margins, but it was not enough. You needed a massive infusion of clean liquid capital immediately, or the offshore clients were going to realize their money was gone. And then my grandfather left me a pristine $4 million estate." I watched the devastating realization hit Vivian and Marcus. They slumped in their seats, finally understanding that they had not been the masterminds of this scheme. They had been the bait. "You wanted that money so badly you were willing to destroy my life to get it." I continued, gesturing to the fraudulent medical evaluation sitting on the judge's bench. "You paid a corrupt doctor to declare me legally incompetent. You orchestrated an emergency conservatorship hearing. But to win that conservatorship, you had to prove to a federal judge that you were a financially responsible steward. You had to prove your wealth. I pointed to the massive leather binders sitting on the bailiff's desk. And thanks to your absolute blinding arrogance, you did exactly what we needed you to do. You walked into a federal courthouse and voluntarily submitted your completely unredacted, highly detailed corporate financial ledgers to the government. You handed the Internal Revenue Service the exact internal accounting documents that prove your Ponzi scheme and your money laundering operations. We did not even have to write a subpoena. You gift-wrapped the evidence and delivered it to us with a bow. Bradley's eyes darted frantically toward the exit doors. His breathing became shallow and rapid. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down on him. He was looking at decades in a federal penitentiary. His wealth, his status, his luxury cars, and his custom suits meant absolutely nothing now. You submitted those documents under penalty of perjury. Judge Harrison interjected, her voice ringing from the bench like a death knell. You swore to this court that they were accurate. If these ledgers contain the evidence of financial crimes, as the prosecution claims, you have committed perjury, wire fraud, and attempted extortion directly in front of a sitting federal judge. Bradley tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the heavy wooden table. The table shifted, scraping loudly against the marble floor. Bradley lost his balance entirely, crashing to the ground in a tangled heap of expensive wool and blind panic. His chair tipped over backwards, hitting the floor with a loud clatter. Chloe screamed. It was not the performative, delicate weeping she had displayed earlier. It was a raw, visceral shriek of absolute terror. She dropped to her knees beside her husband, clawing at his jacket, sobbing hysterically, as Bradley scrambled backward like a crab, trying to put distance between himself and the federal evidence sitting on the desk. Marcus buried his face in his hands, weeping openly. Vivian sat completely paralyzed, her pristine Chanel suit suddenly looking like a prison uniform. The untouchable Wilson family had been entirely dismantled in less than 5 minutes. Agent Hayes nodded to the bailiff. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly burst open. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with FBI and IRS CID emblazoned across the back in bold yellow letters streamed into the room. Their heavy boots pounded against the marble floor, a rhythmic, terrifying march of absolute consequence. They moved with practiced military precision, completely ignoring the chaotic sobbing of the family. 2 agents flanked Marcus, grabbing him by the arms and hauling him to his feet. They kicked his legs apart and slammed him against the oak paneling of the gallery wall, pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing over Vivian's hysterical cries. Another squad of agents descended on Bradley. They did not treat him gently. They hauled the struggling hedge fund manager off the floor, pinning his arms and locking heavy steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. Bradley was weeping now, pleading with his lawyers to do something to stop this. Sterling Vance and his legal team did not even look at him. They were frantically packing their briefcases, refusing to make eye contact with their client, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the fraud they had just unknowingly facilitated. They knew their own licenses were now in extreme jeopardy. Bradley Thornton, Agent Hayes said, walking down the aisle and pulling a printed warrant from his jacket. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and perjury. Your assets are currently being frozen by the federal government. Your corporate headquarters are actively being raided. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it. As the agents began dragging Bradley and Marcus toward the exit, Vivian finally found her voice. She lunged forward, reaching over the wooden railing separating the gallery from the well of the court. Maya, she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. Maya, please, tell them to stop. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot do this to us. I stopped walking. I turned slowly, looking at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, inadequate, and broken. I looked at the mother who had eagerly tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward just to steal my grandfather's money. I stepped closer to the railing. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute calm, quiet finality. "You are not my family, Vivian," I said, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "You are just the criminals I was assigned to investigate, and my investigation is officially closed." I turned my back on her, walking calmly toward the judge's bench to collect the evidence. Behind me, the federal agents hauled my father and my brother-in-law out of the courtroom. The heavy doors swung shut, cutting off Chloe's hysterical sobbing and Vivian's desperate pleas. The silence that settled over the courtroom was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was clean. It was the absolute, undeniable silence of justice finally being served. I gathered the scattered documents from the defendant's table, sliding the fraudulent medical evaluation and Bradley's meticulously faked ledgers into my evidence box. Judge Harrison watched me from the bench, her stern expression softening into a nod of profound professional respect. "You played your part flawlessly, Agent Wilson," she said. "The federal government owes you a debt of gratitude for taking down a predator of this magnitude." I thanked her, my voice steady and resonant, completely devoid of the trembling hesitation I had utilized for the past month. Special Agent Hayes clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, offering a grim, triumphant smile. "Let us go finish taking out the trash," he said. We turned and walked down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy oak doors and stepping out into the expansive marble corridor of the courthouse. The clean silence of the courtroom was instantly replaced by a symphony of absolute chaos. The hallway was swarming with federal agents. Bradley was pressed face first against the cold marble wall, his legs kicked wide apart. An agent was ruthlessly patting him down, emptying his pockets of his platinum money clip, his designer keys, and his phone. They stripped him of his silk tie and his shoelaces, standard protocol for federal detainees to prevent self-harm. Bradley was thrashing, weeping openly, his face smeared with sweat and terror. He kept screaming that he knew senators that he could make a single phone call and have all their badges revoked. The agents completely ignored him, treating the elite hedge fund manager with the exact same cold mechanical efficiency they would use on a street-level dealer. A few yards away, Marcus sat slumped on a wooden bench, his hands secured behind his back with heavy steel cuffs. He was hyperventilating, taking short, ragged breaths as an agent read him his Miranda rights. He looked utterly broken, a hollow shell of the domineering patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist. He was being charged as a primary accomplice in a massive federal racketeering conspiracy. His logistics empire was gone. His reputation was ashes. He would likely spend the rest of his natural life inside a federal penitentiary. Before Hayes and I could take another step, Vivian and Chloe broke away from the periphery of the arrest and lunged toward me. They had been watching the brutal reality of the federal justice system dismantle their lives, and their panic had reached a fever pitch. Vivian grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into my sleeve. The pristine Chanel suit she wore was wrinkled, her pearl necklace hanging askew. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, desperate terror. "Maya, you have to stop this," Vivian pleaded, her voice cracking as she sobbed. "Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them to let your father and your brother-in-law go. You are a federal agent. You have the power to fix this. We are family, Maya. You cannot do this to us. You cannot just throw your own blood away." Chloe crowded in right behind her, mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark tracks. "Please, Maya," she begged, clutching her hands together. "Bradley is a good man. He just made a few mistakes. If they take his money, we will have nothing. We will lose the house, the cars, everything. We are your family. Please forgive us." Agent Hayes stepped forward, moving to physically block them from touching me, but I raised a hand, signaling him to stop. I did not want protection. I wanted to look them directly in the eyes. I looked at Vivian, staring at the woman who had enabled my father's cruelty my entire life. I looked at Chloe, who had smiled while plotting to steal my inheritance. I smoothly detached Vivian's trembling hand from my sleeve, brushing the fabric flat. I looked at them with an expression of absolute icy detachment. The empathy they were begging for had been killed and buried by their own hands. Family. I repeated this word, tasting like poison on my tongue. "You want to talk about family now? Where was family when you threw me out on the street? Where was family when you hired a fake corrupt psychiatrist to declare me insane so you could lock me in a mental ward and steal my grandfather's inheritance? Vivian opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She shrank back, physically withered by the absolute freezing hatred in my voice. You did not treat me like family, I continued, stepping closer, forcing Chloe to retreat. You treated me like an obstacle. You treated me like prey. You thought because I was quiet, because I did not wear designer clothes or drive luxury cars, that I was stupid. You thought you could crush me and take what was mine without a single consequence. You gambled everything on your own arrogance and you lost. I shifted my gaze past them, looking directly at Bradley. He had turned his head against the marble wall, his tear-streaked face staring at me in sheer desperation as the agent tightened the cuffs around his wrists. Bradley once bragged to me, I said, ensuring my voice carried down the echoing corridor loud enough for him to hear every single syllable. He once told me that the justice system is a joke. He told me that courts love rich white guys in expensive suits and that men like him never face real consequences. I offered a cold, ruthless smile. Let us see how a cheap orange prison jumpsuit suits him instead. Bradley let out a guttural, animalistic scream of pure despair as the agents finally pulled him away from the wall and began marching him toward the freight elevators. He kicked and thrashed, begging for his lawyers, begging for a phone call, but his cries were entirely useless. The doors of the elevator slid open, swallowing him and the agents whole. Marcus was hauled to his feet next. He did not fight. He walked with his head bowed, his spirit entirely crushed. He cast one final lingering look in my direction, a look of profound regret and absolute ruin. But I offered him absolutely nothing in return. I watched him step into the elevator beside Bradley, the steel doors sliding shut with a heavy finality, locking them both in a cage of their own making. Chloe let out a devastated wail and collapsed onto the hard marble floor, burying her face in her hands. Her perfect, glamorous life had just been entirely obliterated. There would be no more country club dinners, no more European vacations, no more blind privilege. Her husband's assets were already frozen. Their bank accounts were seized. She was going to return to a home surrounded by federal tape and face a mountain of debts she could never possibly repay. Vivian stood completely paralyzed, staring at the closed elevator doors. She looked entirely empty, stripped of the wealth and status that had defined her entire existence. She was a hollow shell, left with absolutely nothing but the wreckage of the family she had helped destroy. I turned away from them, adjusting the strap of my evidence bag over my shoulder. Agent Hayes fell into step beside me as we walked down the long corridor toward the main exit. The sunlight streaming through the front glass doors of the courthouse seemed impossibly bright, cutting through the shadows of the building. I walked out into the crisp morning air, taking a deep, refreshing breath. The game was over. The hunt was finished. The slate was finally wiped completely clean. The fallout from that morning in the courtroom was spectacular and absolute. Vanguard Financial Management collapsed within 48 hours of the raid. The federal government seized every single asset, freezing bank accounts, liquidating properties, and draining the offshore havens Bradley thought were entirely untouchable. Marcus watched in complete horror as his vast logistics empire was systematically dismantled, piece by piece, auctioned off to pay for massive federal fines and victim restitution. Vivian and Marcus lost the sprawling mansion, their luxury imported cars, and their pristine country club memberships. They went from the absolute apex of high society to toxic pariahs overnight. Their wealthy friends vanished completely, refusing to return their calls and literally changing directions when they saw them walking down the street. Chloe was forced out of her designer penthouse and into a tiny rundown apartment in a heavily neglected neighborhood. Stripped of her trust fund and her husband's stolen money, she had to take a minimum wage retail job just to survive, all while drowning under the mountainous legal debts Bradley had left behind. They had absolutely nothing left but the bitter, stinging reality of their own insatiable greed. Camera direction cut back to the present day. The view transitions to a softly lit, luxurious living room. The camera dollies in slowly toward Maya. She sits comfortably on a plush sofa, raising a steaming ceramic mug of coffee to her lips. Her eyes gleam with a sharp, undeniable confidence and profound pride. 6 months later, I stood in a grand, heavily guarded auditorium in Washington, D.C. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation pinned a commendation medal to my lapel, officially recognizing my instrumental role in mapping and dismantling one of the most sophisticated financial syndicates on the East Coast. The applause in the room was deafening, but the true reward was not the shiny medal or the federal recognition. The real payoff came a week later when I finally unlocked the heavy oak front door of my grandfather's estate. I stepped over the threshold, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of old wood and worn leather. I walked through the quiet, sunlit halls, tracing my fingers over his antique desk. The house was no longer a battleground or a prize to be stolen by greedy relatives. There was no more screaming. There was no more manipulation. There were no more predatory glances or whispered insults. There was only pure, absolute peace. I had protected my grandfather's legacy, and I had finally secured my own future. The best way to destroy those who look down on you is not to scream and prove you are right. Let them be arrogant. Hand them the rope and sit back to watch them hang themselves. Thank you for listening to my story. Please like and subscribe to know that justice does not come naturally. You have to seize it with your own hands.